masterminds, but more for their celebrity, without wishing to be too unkind. We do get some slightly bizarre ones. I'm going to take just 2 minutes, and then the main event. Izzy, 2 minutes to test you on mastermind, okay? Celebrity mastermind, because we had this bloke on. He was a soap opera star. We give them slightly easier questions, honestly, on mastermind, particularly the first one. So the first question I asked this bloke was, what breakfast cereal, okay, you concentrating, what breakfast cereal do you associate with prison? Porridge, yes, God, for a minute I thought, whew, I know this is the country, but still. Anyway, his answer was not porridge, Cheerios. I couldn't decide whether he was making an acute observation on the government's penal policy or whether he just bloody thick. I think it was that. Anyway, right. 3 more very quick ones. This is a politician. I'll tell you who he was in a second. I've got to shout out the answer again. A bit more difficult, admittedly. Who succeeded Henry VIII? Edward VI. Okay. Edward VI it was indeed. He, however, said Henry VII. What was the name of the prison that they stormed in Paris in 1789?
Bastille.
Bastille, not Versailles. and what was the surname of the lady, her first name was Marie, who discovered radiation? Marie Curie indeed, not as he suggested, Antoinette. I'll now tell you who it was. His name was David Lammy. He was at the time Her Majesty's Minister of State for Higher Education. And moving from somebody who did not know very much at all to somebody who knows a huge amount about what's arguably the most important issue facing us today, in the sense that we are aware that climate change, the climate, whatever you want to call it, the climate emergency, is the great crisis facing the world. There can be no doubt about that. I imagine we would agree on that. But how do we get there? How do we create the sort of world that we want to live in, and it is capable of sustaining us in all sorts of different ways? And Isabella, or Izzy, as a lot of people know her, knows as much about that as anybody, because she and her husband Charlie have done something utterly remarkable. I've been there with Sarah, spent the weekend there looking around this wonderful 3,000 acres of, well, what can I say, wild country, and it takes your breath away. But I'm not going to tell you about it, because Izzy obviously knows all that. She's written the most magnificent book. You must buy a copy if you haven't already got one before you leave. Anyway, would you please welcome Izzy?
Thank you very much indeed. I just want to start by playing a little sound. And if you know what it is, and especially if you've heard it in the last few years, you'll know how lucky you are. It is the sound of the turtle dove. Here they are, the 2 turtle doves my true love gave to me at Christmas. They are the most likely bird, the most likely species to go extinct within our shores in the next 10 to 15 years, according to the RSPB. So to me, this is a sort of huge nostalgic loss. I mean, when I was growing up in the 1960s, we had 125,000 pairs of turtle doves. And to me, as I'm sure to many of you, it was the sound of summer. It was just as familiar to me as the cuckoo, another hugely declining bird. But this bird has declined 97% since the 1960s. It's the stuff of Chaucer, it's the stuff of Shakespeare, it's in our cultural DNA, and it is a huge cultural loss as much as anything. But I think what it symbolises really is more than that, because it's, in a way, it's our canary in the mine. It symbolises what else has gone before that we didn't even know existed, that we hadn't put a name to, that has already gone extinct from our shores. And it's also pulling in its wake all these other species like nightingales and cuckoos and the rest. So it's a sense of, it symbolises really what is happening to Britain at the moment. And for us at NEP, it has begun to symbolise both the despair of what is happening, but also hope, because it's also become a symbol of what's happening at NEP. So the reason the turtle dove is declining is complicated, like it is with all our African migrants. It comes a hell of a long way from Africa, so travelling over 3,500 miles one way. We know that its habitat in Africa is changing too, so that's going to be affecting it. And then of course we've got increasing weather events, so these big storms that are happening increasingly with climate change can just throw these birds off course and throw them out to the ocean, and we lose them forever. If they do happen to make it as far as the Mediterranean, then they've got to cross the Mediterranean, and then they face the firing squads of Malta, of the southern Spain, of France even, where it's still killed in the hundreds of thousands, even though there's a moratorium on shooting it. What's interesting though is that in Europe, the numbers of turtle doves are declining, but they're declining on a kind of a regular trajectory. In some countries in Europe, they're not declining at all. Compared to Britain, where it is just literally falling off a cliff edge. And so something strange and something different is happening in Britain to the turtle dove, as well as so many other species. And the reason is this: it's the wholesale transformation of our countryside since the Second World War. So we're all familiar with the Dig for Victory campaign and why we needed to start ploughing up our land. We were facing starvation, all our supply routes were cut, and the government incentivised farmers to plough up every single available piece of land. What we forget, I think, is that this was a moment of crisis. It wasn't ever intended to continue ad infinitum. And indeed, when rationing was over in the 1950s, there were many agronomists in Britain who were arguing that we had to go back to a more sustainable form of agriculture. We had to go back to rotational systems, rotational cropping. We had to let land lie fallow. We had to keep our soils in good heart. And we forgot that message because we became hooked on chemical agriculture, and we know that trajectory that we've gone down. And just this addiction that we have, thanks to subsidies, almost entirely, is what has led us down this route of the sort of impoverization of our land. So we know that we have, and this effect has happened, the knock-on effect on what's happened to nature has been absolutely immense. So we know that from the 1960s to now, we've lost 40 million birds in our skies. There would have been 40 million more birds in the skies in the 1960s than there are today. We ploughed up 75,000 miles of hedgerows since the Second World War. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows. We've lost 90% of our lowland heathland and 90% of our wetlands. So it's incredible, this impact that has had on our landscape, and yet we almost have forgotten that that ever existed. We look at this now and we think that it's absolutely normal. Well, this was our farm 20 years ago, and we thought it was totally normal too. This is where we are. It's Knepp Castle in Sussex. It's about 44 miles south of central London. It's a Nash castle. It was built for Charlie, my husband's family, 200 odd years ago, and it sits in the middle of 3,500 acres. When we were in our early 20s, we inherited this estate from Charlie's grandparents. This was in the early 1980s, and as I say, every single inch of that land had been ploughed up for agriculture, even the water meadows and the Repton Park around the house, which had been kind of sacrosanct even during the First World War. But when we inherited from Charlie's grandparents, it was intensive arable and dairy, and it was already a failing farm. The business was heavily in debt, and I suppose with the sort of arrogance of youth, or maybe the optimism of youth, felt that it was down to his grandparents, that they hadn't invested in infrastructure, they didn't know the latest technologies, and Charlie had just come out of agricultural college, had always assumed he was going to be a farmer, he knew he was going to take over this place, and he felt that he could turn it around. child of the Green Revolution, misnomer if ever there was one, but he felt that we could make a go of it, and so that's what we did. For the next 17 years, we did what every good farmer is supposed to do. We bought bigger machinery, we invested in infrastructure, we amalgamated dairies, we built state-of-the-art milking parlours that looked like something out of NASA. We experimented with different varieties of crops. We sold the old breed, dual-purpose red poll herd that had been the darlings of his grandparents, and we bought better milkers, we bought Holsteins and Friesians, we bought milk quota. And of course, in an effort to increase our yields, we put more and more and more chemicals on the land. So more fertiliser, more pesticides, more herbicides, more fungicides. And still, after 17 years, we were more in debt than ever before. We were £1.5 million in debt, and we knew we couldn't go on. And the reason was this. It was Sussex clay. So I think some of you may be on clay around here, but the Sussex clay, if you're not familiar with it, is absolutely unforgiving stuff. And we sit on 320 metres of it over a bedrock of limestone. I think the Inuit is supposed to have dozens of different words for different types of snow, but in ancient Sussex dialect there's over 35 words for different types of mud. That's how much it governs our lives. So it's like unfathomable porridge in the winter, and in summer it just bakes as hard as concrete. You can literally put your arm up to your shoulder in a crack in the summer when it's been a very dry summer. So basically, in a wet winter, you cannot get heavy machinery onto the land. You just can't maintain your ditches, you can't do any maintenance at all, and you can't grow spring crops, which makes you absolutely uncompetitive when you're trying to compete with farms on grade 1 and grade 2, and we're mostly grade 4. So it was this that really was against us the whole time, and it took us 17 years to realise that. And when we finally realised, and we eventually, in 1999 it was, that Charlie actually made the big decision that we couldn't go on. And it was a very bold decision, I think. I mean, first of all, it was hugely distressing, because, you know, we had a farm manager, a friend who we loved, and we had to make him redundant, and 9 farm workers lost their jobs, and we had to sell our 3 beautiful dairy herds, which were amazingly good. I mean, astonishingly, they were consistently in the top 10 dairy herds in the country. So it wasn't like we were bad farmers. It was just that the circumstances of our land were endlessly against us. But making this decision was also very controversial from the point of view of, I think, the culture around us, certainly from Charlie's family, who felt that, you know, that if you were born to farm, if you could make 2 blades of grass grow where one had grown before, that's what got you to heaven. That was the family motto. And we were suddenly going against that. And neighbours too were feeling that this was a very irresponsible move to start selling them farm machinery and stop farming. But I don't know if any of you have ever been in the unfortunate position of being in a failing business, but when you are, you're very blinkered, and you are looking directly at what's happening all the time. And any change in your fortunes, any increase in yields, any glimmer of hope, you grab at, and you just hope that you're going to see through to the next month, the next year. It's only when you actually say, okay, enough is enough, and you draw a line under that, and you change your perspective and say, we're going to stop farming, that suddenly your mind opens up, and you become much more objective, much more clear thinking, much more creative about what the options are. And it was then, once we'd stopped farming, that we met this extraordinary guy, Franz Vera. This is in 2000 that we first met him. He's the grey-haired man on the right there. He's a Dutch ecologist, and in the year that we had given up our farming business, his book, Grazing Ecology and Forest History, was published in English. So it was sending shockwaves through the ecological and sort of scientific community at the time. Because what he was saying was that in all our imaginings of what temperate zone Europe had been like before human impact, we've completely forgotten about all the herds of free-roaming animals that would have been here. So we've forgotten about the aurochs, the ancestor of the cow, the ancient ox. We've forgotten about tarpan, the original horse. We've forgotten about bison, about elk, about reindeer and about red deer that would have been a riverine species back in the day. We've forgotten about wild boar, we've forgotten about beavers by the million. There would have been millions in Britain alone. And if you start thinking about all these animals and putting them back in the landscape in your head, what you get is a much, much more open landscape, much more dynamic, much more biodiverse, much more like the Serengeti, say, in Africa, than the kind of closed canopy idea that we have in our heads, you know, the myth that a squirrel could have run from John O'Groats to Land's End without touching the ground. There's this kind of rather, it's almost kind of Freudian, I think, this sort of myth that we tell ourselves about how important man is in creating nature. So, you know, that Europe was a closed canopy forest, and man came along with his axe and cut the virgin forest down and sowed his seed in the virgin soil, and then there popped up this sort of amazing biodiverse landscape. Well, it wasn't down to man, it was actually down to these amazing ancient herbivores, these megafauna that were here already. They were keeping it much more open. They were the ones that were keeping open a habitat that was, you know, amazingly diverse. That's what our ecology had grown up with. So what France is saying is that if you want to recover biodiversity, the way you do that is to introduce these animals into the landscape and let them do the management for you. The way they trample, the way they disturb the soil, the way they ringbark trees, the way they eat, the dung, the urine, everything they do, their disturbance, is what generates open landscapes and what stimulates the conditions for the rest of wildlife to exist, to fly, literally. And so meeting this man and hearing these extraordinary theories at the time that we were suddenly open to ideas was really the turning point in the year 2000. And we decided, well, let's do an experiment and let's see if we can put France's theories into practice on our land. And if we can recover biodiversity just a little on our severely depleted post-agricultural soils, that would be interesting enough. And so that is what we did. We started to smash up the drains. Charlie had an amazing time doing every boy's dream of smashing up drains and just letting the water flow and letting the water sit where it had always wanted to sit on our land, on our heavy clay. We let the ditches silt up. We took up about 250 miles of internal fences. Imagine the cost for a farmer of that. And we basically just let it go. And soon enough, you were seeing pulses of vegetation coming up, thorny scrub, bramble, hawthorn, blackthorn, dog rose, and all of this was providing a nursery for jay-sown oak trees and crab apples and all the other species of tree that were coming up in these little nurseries of thickets. So suddenly we were having something very dynamic, something very interesting going on in the landscape. And where the water was sitting already, we were having aquatic plants coming in, invertebrates, and of course wildfowl, waterfowl coming in. So we knew that we were onto something really exciting, and that was just literally in about year 1 or 2. And then, once we had finally, after a bit of a struggle trying to persuade the powers that be that we weren't completely mad, we managed to get high-level stewardship funding to put a ring fence around the whole area so that we could release our free-roaming animals. So really the idea here is that you're just letting the animals do the management for you, and you're just sitting back and sitting on your hands, essentially, which for human beings is difficult, but for farmers is particularly difficult. So it was going to be a definite challenge for us. But this is what we started to do. Now, because we obviously haven't got some of these megafauna in our landscape anymore, we hunted to extinction the aurochs and the tarpan and the bison from our shores, at least. They're beginning to come back in Europe, where they're proving to be a keystone species in rewilding in Europe. But we don't have access to these animals, and some of them are extinct. We don't have the beaver, that's coming back too, I'm glad to say. But you can use proxies of them. And so what we're using is essentially their descendants. And our proxy for the aurochs is the Old English longhorn. So none of these animals are in our system are supplementary fed. We don't provide buildings for them to shelter in. Well, there are actually a couple of defunct barns, but they never use them. But what they're doing, they're generating this disturbance in the landscape in order to kickstart the dynamism that you want for biodiversity. And the key thing about cows is that they don't just eat grass. They are browsers originally. And so their disturbance, the way they eat vegetation in different ways, is hugely important to open up niches for other kinds of wildlife. An animal like this can transport 230 different seed species in its gut and its hooves and its fur. So it's a hugely important vector for flora. They eat in one area and then they'll dung those seeds out in another area in a perfect sort of pile of dung ready to take off. They're also obviously transporting minerals and nutrients, and in the past this would have been a massively important process throughout our landscape, as you get animals moving from the shore right up to the mountaintops, transporting minerals with them, keeping that cycle of nutrients going. It's something we've completely lost in our static form of farming today, where we're just keeping animals in one place and harvesting them the whole time. So they're hugely important vectors of species, as well as disturbers. And then we've got Exmoor ponies being our tarpan, the original horse. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the cave paintings of Lascaux in France. It's about 17,500 years old. But the cave paintings of the horse in Lascaux are almost exactly like the Exmoor. And again, the Exmoor is eating and disturbing, but it's eating completely different things to the cow. So it has a completely different stomach, completely different teeth, obviously different mouthpiece, it has upper teeth unlike the cow. So its influence on vegetation is completely different. They're doing this incredible research in Kenya, I've just been reading about Princeton University in Kenya, and what they've discovered is this amazing relationship that equines and bovines have with each other. So in Kenya they did these experiments, and if you have 100 head of cattle in a given area, and you allow them to graze alongside an equine, and that can be a donkey, a horse, or even a zebra, those 100 cows will put on 60% more weight than if they had been grazing that area on their own. It's completely counterintuitive, but the way it works is that the horses are eating the really prickly, thick, the prickly bushes and the kind of thick, tough grasses that the cows just can't stomach. And with the horses taking that out, that then facilitates the sweeter grasses underneath that benefits the cows. And they're beginning to find this on Dartmoor too, that actually there's a relationship between the Dartmoor ponies and cattle grazing on the hill there, that actually the equines facilitate the bovine. So I have this amazing sort of idea in my head that in days gone by we would have had herds of tarpan moving through the landscape, and then in their wake you would have had the aurochs coming back behind them, eating the grasses that the tarpan would have facilitated. And then we've got 3 different types of deer. So we had roe deer already in small numbers, but we also introduced fallow and red deer. Again, the idea is the different mouthpieces, the different grazing preferences, the different vegetation that they choose. Particularly in the rut, the fallow and the red deer are incredible disturbers. They'll turf up the ground with their antlers and paw the soil. So every little thing that they do, these animals, they're creating, opening up niches for other life. And then there's my favourite. That's our wild boar. But that's a Tamworth pig standing in for the wild boar. And the amazing thing is, when you notice these, you see these domesticated animals released into a landscape, they completely surprise you. I mean, who would have thought that a Tamworth pig would behave like a hippo? These animals can hold their breath for 120 seconds, and they go down to the bottom of the lakes, and they're eating swan mussels. I don't know how I'll display that again, because I do so love the Tamworth. So they go down, they dive down, they can hold their breath for 120 seconds, and they bring these swan mussels up, and they'll carry them to the bank, and then open them with their trotters and take the flesh out of the middle. So, I mean, as farmers, we were looking at our cows, for example, and I thought, that they were quite nice creatures, but they were pretty boring. They were endlessly with their heads down in a green field doing not much. But it's only when you release them into a landscape that they can fully express themselves, you realise the full potential of these animals and their ingenuity and their cleverness. And so it wasn't the animals in our farm situation that were boring, it was the situation we put them in. But when they have free reign of this kind of territory, they are just completely, fully expressive, amazing animals. But what the pig obviously is doing for us is this disturbance, and it's rootling. So when it rootles up the ground like this, you can imagine that's a very heavy grass sward, and it's pretty impenetrable to most seeds. They're not going to be able to take off. But once you've got a little rootled area with a bit of damp soil showing, you can see how quickly that changes into something else. I mean, so quickly Charlie's feet haven't even moved. But you see how complex that is already, that area is completely different. And so it's thanks to the pigs that we think that we're now getting many of our native wildflowers back at Knepp, and I'm trying so hard to train myself not to call them weeds, because these are our beautiful little native wildflowers. And Plant Life has a huge amount to say about this, how we have not only zero tolerance for our native species in arable conditions, but in our own gardens and on our roadside verges. And so these plants are going extinct. I think every alternate year, one of our native wildflowers goes extinct in a county in Britain. So the trajectory is still catastrophic. But thanks to the rootling of the pigs, we're now getting plants like birdsfoot trefoil, scarlet pimpernel, that's supposed to be a red clover. We're getting things like black medic, vetches, vetchlings. We've got fumitory for the first time colonising Knepp this year. And all these native wildflowers have these tiny little seeds which are really protein rich. So a huge number of birds depend on those seeds. And that's really the reason why so many of them have been going extinct, because their food source is just missing from our landscape. So about 5 or 6 years into our project, we began to hear our first turtle dove, because the turtle dove is one of the birds that depends on these tiny little wildflower species. And so to us that was a complete amazement. Nobody could have predicted that we could have got turtle doves back on Knepp, on our kind of depleted agricultural land underneath the Gatwick stacking system. One of our rarest birds was suddenly appearing. And last year we had 20 singing males. So if you think that turtle dove, they're so shy you can hardly ever see them, so you can only really count them from hearing the male singing. And the female doesn't sing. So we know that they're breeding the turtle doves at Knepp, because we've seen fledglings and we've even managed to ring a couple. So we could have had last year as many as 30 turtle doves, say, at least, which, according to Matthew Oates, who's the nature specialist at the National Trust, we have probably more turtle doves on our 3,500 acres of Knepp than the National Trust does on 250,000 hectares. So it's a complete turnaround. It's absolutely astonishing. And you can kind of see why this has happened, because this is what Knepp looked like in the old farming days. And this is what happens. You know, a turtle dove wouldn't have landed in anything like that. But you can see as it begins to heal itself with rewilding, that's suddenly going to look from the sky a lot more inviting to a turtle dove. And this is what the turtle dove sees from the ground, so on its kind of withered bough, as Shakespeare puts it. This is thorny scrub. And again, to the modern eye, the modern taste, this is wasteland. People look at this, and particularly if you're a farmer, you think, oh my God, let's get rid of that. And you send in those huge machines and take it all out. But it's actually one of the most biodiverse habitats there is. This is where life really takes off. And this is where the turtle dove is finding a place to nest. So it's protected from that predation by the thorny scrub. It's got those native wildflower species in there, so it's finding its food source, and it's also got clean water. So that's again another thing that's really increasingly difficult to find in our landscape, and turtle doves are particularly picky about their water. They want really pure water. So we know that the water standing on Knepp is now of the highest possible quality. It comes onto our land rich with nitrates and pollutants from the roads and the farms around us. But once it's been through our kind of filtration of the soil and the vegetation, it is purified. It's actually the highest possible quality. So it's finding all the things it needs to thrive and to breed. But it's not the only thing we've introduced are the free roaming animals. But we've now got all 5 UK species of owl, including the little owl on the left here, which is going crazy because of our dung beetles in particular. It's a beetle specialist. And so obviously now we're not putting ivermectins, wormers into the cattle. We don't give them antibiotics. They're as natural as they can possibly be. The proliferation of dung beetles has been absolutely astonishing. And Charlie, who is a bit of a kind of bug fetish, he's particularly fond of dung beetles. And I couldn't work out what he was doing the other day. This is a couple of years ago, and he was following the cows around with his mobile phone. And every time a cow did a cow pat, he dropped his stomach next to the cow pat with his mobile phone. And I couldn't work out what he was doing, but he was timing how long it took the dung beetle to find the cow pat. And I think the record was under 60 seconds. So that was, he was very happy that summer, but then he started moving his experiments into the kitchen, which wasn't quite so popular, and he started bringing dung into the kitchen and rootling around on the kitchen table and putting things into test tubes and awful things in the freezer. But at the end of the summer, he had found a cowpat that contained 23 different species of dung beetle, which is astonishing in itself. But one of the dung beetles is the violet door beetle, which hasn't been seen in Sussex for 50 years. So it's astonishing how these creatures find you once the habitat and the opportunity has come back. Then we've got 13 out of the 18 UK species of bat. And again, they're coming in, some of them are flying in from 20, 30 miles away. The barbicel bats are coming in from that far because of our proliferation of insects. They're finding fantastically rich pickings with us. This is actually a Beckstein's bat, which is so rare, it's rare even in Europe, and we don't know much about it at all. But we've got other things. I mean, all these incredibly rare species have come back to come to net. So we've got lesser spotted woodpecker, we've got a peregrine falcon, we've got peregrine falcons nesting in a tree, which is almost unheard of. I mean, they're supposed to be cliff-top dwellers, but you know, they're finding it quite happy in a tree at net. We've got ravens, we've got woodcock, we've got snipe, we've got cuckoos. We ringed 3 cuckoos last year and radio tagged them, and they went all the way to Africa. Incredibly stressful watching them go and then watching them come back. They all came back this year, and now one of them went to the Sahara and has come back again because it was so dry, and oh my god, we're waiting for them to make the big crossing across the Sahara. The one named after my father typically is the one lagging behind. And then we've got nightingales, so we've become one of the densest breeding populations of nightingales in Britain. I think there's one area in Britain that has more nightingales per acre than us, and that's a place called Lodge Hill in Kent. It's ex-MOD land, so it's got that amazing thorny scrub on it. But it's been zoned for housing, so we just don't know if we might be unfortunately the top breeding spot for nightingales soon. So all these species have found us of their own accord. And then purple emperor butterflies. Again, we're by far now the biggest breeding hotspot for purple emperor butterflies, and this is our second. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a purple emperor butterfly until we had them. But it's our second largest butterfly, and it's almost like an honorary bird. It behaves like a bird, so it's very territorial, it's very aggressive. It will chase blue tits. You can throw a stick up into the sky and it'll chase the stick. It's an astonishing bird, and it doesn't do the delicate butterfly thing of landing on flowers and delicately sipping a bit of nectar. What it really likes is fox scat. That's its main preference. And then the sap runs on our oaks. It loves that. It get very drunk on that sort of oozing sap from the oaks. But again, we think that this species has come back at net because its main food plant is the sallow. Again, it's a hybridizing willow that is just not tolerated at all in our landscape anymore because it's perceived to have no use. And this has a very short germination period, its seed, that it blows like that downy fluff, like snowstorms you see in April. It only has 2 weeks, the sallow seed, to be viable, and it has to find open, damp soil in that period, or the seeds don't germinate. So what's providing that open, damp soil is the pig. So again, we've seemed to have surprised the lepidopterists of the world, because they're now beginning to recognise that actually wild boar in the countryside would have been a really crucial part of the life cycle of the purple emperor. It's what provides their food plant. So we're sort of, in a funny way, rewriting the textbooks, I think, because one of the things that I think we forget is modern scientists, ecologists, is that we're observing species a lot of the time in a depleted landscape, often not in their ideal conditions, so where they're just clinging on by their fingernails. And it's only when you present them with differences and different opportunities in this sort of kaleidoscope of habitats that they show where they actually would rather be. And so that's, I think, one of the values of NEP, of the Rewilding Project, that NEP is showing actually what these species actually prefer given a chance. So what we're doing now at NEP is completely different. It's obviously, the landscape looks completely different to that earlier shot I showed you of the intensive farming. We are still farming, or we call ourselves farmers, because the one mechanism, the management that we do, is we control the numbers of animals. So we want to keep them very, very low, the numbers of them, so that they're not overgrazing. So what you want to do is you want to have that battle between the vegetation succession and animal disturbance. That's what creates the dynamism, the sort of mosaic of habitats that you want. So we cull the animals and we produce 75 tonnes of organic, free-roaming, premium, self-medicating meat. And to my mind, if you're still eating meat, this is the kind of meat you should be eating, from a sustainable, pasture-fed source, organic, not from an industrial farm system, which is unsustainable and unethical, I think, to my mind, on every level. So we do have an important income stream that comes from that, and of course now almost all of that is profit, because we have no inputs. No, we're not feeding them, there's no veterinary bills, or very negligible veterinary bills, so almost everything we get from that is profit. But the other things that we're doing is we're providing what has become known as public goods, the sort of ecosystem services, if you like, for the public, the other services other than food, things that we are desperately in need of. So rewilding is kind of addressing some of the crises that are facing us right now, like flood mitigation. We know that our soils are now holding back water and releasing it much more slowly, so that properties and roads and culverts below us that used to flood every time there was a big rain don't do that anymore. We're cleaning water, as I described. We're also purifying the air, and think of that as an important, concept of how we could have rewilded areas around our cities, perhaps, to clean the air and take some of that bill off the NHS for the polluted-related illnesses that we're suffering from. But we're also restoring the soil, and this is hugely important. There's some papers, scientists are now saying that we have 100 harvests left globally before we have no topsoil left in which to plant anything. And that's because we've degraded our soils so much through ploughing and chemical abuse that the soil is just flying off into the wind, or it's washing out down the rivers, down out to sea. And so what's happening at NEP is we've shown that our soils can restore very, very quickly. Within 20 years, we know that we've doubled the soil carbon, we've tripled the soil biota, and we've tripled the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, that amazing network of roots that goes underground like a kind of amazing sort of chemical circuit board that feeds the plants with nutrients. So if you can restore your soils in such a short space of time, this is possibly a solution for some of our most depleted soils. I mean, you can think of the fens, where there's only about 15 years of harvest left. You could actually rewild areas of the fens, and you could do it in a rotational system, so that you can actually restore your soils and then go back into a system of rotational farming, of regenerative farming, once you come out of rewilding. So there's all sorts of ways that this could work with farming to be its closest ally, really, rather than the enemy that often farmers perceive it to be. And then, of course, there's carbon sequestration, and we know that we have to start sequestering carbon. This kind of wood pasture system, where you've got grazing animals in it, stimulating the plants and the grass to continue growing the roots underneath the soil, is one of the best ways there is to sequester carbon. as well as growing our soil. So it's hugely important from that kind of aspect. But I think from Charlie and my point of view, that from a personal point of view, I would say, I think that one of the most interesting things has been the effect that rewilding has had on us. From being farmers, the kind of micromanaging farmers that we were 20 years ago, to now, has been a really extraordinary and very profound effect. But it's also been a very unexpected one. I mean, I think it's something to live somewhere where the landscape is actually humming, thrumming, heaving with life, is just the most joyful thing you can possibly think of. It's that wonderful leap of joy you get when you hear a turtle dove touring in the thickets beside you on a lovely summer's evening. It's sort of inexplicable. E.O. Wilson, the great American biologist, has this word for it. It's biophilia. It's that innate desire in all of us to connect with living things. And that's what NEP feels like. And I think people who come and visit NEP and feel it too, is that you feel that sense of kind of completeness, that this is where we are meant to be. It's something that I think as we become increasingly urban, we also increasingly feel the need for and the lack of in our lives. So we need these wild spaces. But I think really what the question is if there are so many benefits from rewilding, why aren't more people doing it? Well, we've had a lot of people at NEP, particularly in the last year or two, who have come to see us. Charlie likes to count up the acreage, and so between the kind of the landowners and the farmers and the NGOs and the farm clusters, we've had about 1 million acres worth of interested people coming to see NEP, thinking of doing something like this themselves on their land. So there's massive interest. But I think it's one thing to come to NEP and say, we love what you're doing, we think it's great, but it's another to go back to your own land and actually do it. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think the main obstacle, one of them, is a question of aesthetics. Because we've grown up with this very fixed idea of what the British countryside should look like. It's very managed, it's very manicured, it's straight edges everywhere, it's canalised rivers, it's hedges flail within an inch of their lives, if you're lucky enough to have hedges. If you're lucky enough to have ancient woodland, it's surrounded by massive monocultures of arable, and everything is managed and controlled. So I think if we're going to embrace rewilding and understand how it works and how much it has to offer us and how many solutions it offers us for the crises facing us today, we have to change our mindset. We've got to learn how to become messy again. We've got to rid ourselves of that kind of Victorian obsession, that corseted obsession we have with tidying up. We've got to free our minds and allow ourselves to consider having free-roaming animals around our landscape again, and boom and bust cycles of nature that may be unpredictable and uncomfortable. But we've got to change the way we think. And so I think rewilding is as much about appreciating what it can do for us and how it works, as about rewilding ourselves. Thank you.
That was brilliant.
Sorry.
But. And I say but, because obviously one can't argue against the effect of what you've been doing. Quite clearly, I've seen it for myself. It is quite extraordinary. And it is a wonderful nature reserve. But what I would argue, and you'll appreciate that I have to do this. You know. I can't not argue. That's why they wanted me to come here today. I would argue, whether I like it or not, that this isn't farming, and therefore you are not in any way, just about, we'll qualify it a bit in a moment if you like, but you're not providing an example to those farmers in this room those farmers, you know, we look out there. This is a somewhat unusual farm that we're on at the moment, but I've just driven down from London and driven through hundreds of thousands of acres of exactly the kind of farmland that you wanted yours to be at one point. So it is quite wonderful, but it's irrelevant is too strong a word, but it's not relevant to the problems in many respects that we face in this country, in the world today, when we consider agriculture.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about food this time,
I am precisely talking
exactly,
about
and food security. No, we are specifically a nature project. So, I mean, first and foremost is about nature and all these other public goods, you know, that I was talking about, the carbon sequestration and that kind of thing. I think the first thing, you know, when we're discussing anything to do with food is this kind of thing, it's always the elephant in the room, which no one ever seems to acknowledge, is how much food we waste. So we are already producing enough food for 11 billion people, and we waste between 30 and 40% of it. So we've got to address the food waste first.
That's not relevant entirely to what you're talking about here.
No.
Is it? I mean, that is a separate, certainly that's a crisis in and of itself, but it isn't relevant to now.
What it means is that when you're talking to, say, the NFU, who are saying we need every inch of land for farming, and we can't afford to spare land for this, that actually we can. The important thing to I think we have to get back to every time is the soil. We have to restore our soils. So we cannot continue farming as we are.
Of course.
So we have to do regenerative farming. So this isn't a solution for that. This is how we can get wildlife back into our landscape. It's how we can get nature connected so that our species survive, our pollinating insects survive. What we're beginning to understand, though, through regenerative farming is that your yields actually increase if you have areas of nature like this contiguous with it. So we have to completely change our mindset and get away from chemical farming.
But again, if you take that as a practical suggestion, if you look at the area around here, this is not a bad area. I mean, it's not mostly anyway, not prime farming land, but it is very good land by and large. There's a lot of very good land around here. The idea that any farmer who owns, I mean, let's say he owns 1,000 or she owns 1,000 acres, would be able to take out a quarter, a third, and rewild it, and still A, show a profit, and B, within a realistic period of time, be able to produce the sort of level of food that they're producing at the moment. Let's bear in mind how long it took you to get where you are today, a very long time. And admittedly, as you say, dreadful clay, dreadful soil, and all of that. But nonetheless, I come back to the thing, it simply isn't practical.
This was 20 years, which I think actually is very fast, I mean, to restore your soils.
Well, with the greatest of respect, 20 years, if you've got a fair amount of money, if you don't have to pay rent on the land, if you're getting a large amount of subsidy, which obviously you have to have, would be a hell of a long time for somebody who has to pay rent on the land, who has to have all the costs.
Well, I think what we're seeing now is a move to change, you know, post-Brexit, changing the farming subsidy system. So what's going to happen?
You want to bet?
I don't want to bet on anything. But I think what the move is to move away from providing subsidies for farmers to produce food irrespective of what soil they're on and whether it should be grown there. And instead, the subsidy, the new ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, idea is to reward farmers who are doing good practice. And that is restoring soils, not polluting your water, and increasing biodiversity. So the subsidy system will move away from that intensive.
May move away.
May. It has to, actually, because we don't have that resource left, and we may delay it, but our topsoil will not be there.
But you're applying, if I may say so, a commonsensical view to a certain group of people who aren't necessarily where they are today because of their common sense.
Amazing things are happening all over.
They're called policy. Less there were any doubt about this.
But I think the evidence is there, the movement is there, it's just beginning. I think we are at the beginning of a movement that was where alternative energy was 20 years ago, and everyone was saying alternative energy, that's never going to happen, we're never going to outcompete, fossil fuels. We know that is going to happen.
I think that's a slightly dodgy comparison, though, isn't it? Because
no, I don't think so, because I think what's happening now, we know that we have to restore our soils. We've seen farmers like Gabe Brown in North Dakota who's...
you can restore your soil by farming organically. You don't have to rewild.
No, but this isn't about farming, the rewilding. It's about restoring nature. So we're talking at cost purposes.
But that's what I wanted to establish right at the beginning, because you are perfectly properly, and it's wonderful to hear you. You're evangelical about what you've done there, as you should be.
No, we're not expecting the whole of Britain to be turned into rewilding.
But you are expecting, because as you said a moment ago, a conventional farmer, let's use the word conventional for the sake of argument, and maybe it isn't conventional, but anyway, would do much better if she had some rewilded land on the doorstep, as it were, because that would achieve all sorts of... So you are proselytizing on behalf of...
Yeah. It works hand in hand. But I mean, there is a way that rewilding could actually be part of the reconstitution of land, of the regeneration of soil, which I sort of alluded to just thinking about the fens. Was one of the advisors to Natural England came up with this sort of brilliant epithet, pop-up NEPs. So you could actually, as I was sort of trying to describe, you could rewild a certain area for, say, a generation. And again, that is one of the hurdles for people, landowners, to rewild, because a lot of landowners are reluctant to rewild in perpetuity. It's an uncomfortable situation to be in, to be locked into one system forever. But what you could do is you can encourage landowners to, on depleted soils, to rewild for, say, 25, 30 years for a generation, and then once you've done that, you send in those huge machines from the Forestry Commission that can take the whole lot out and turn it back into regenerative farming. So you've restored your soils, you've cleaned your water, you've provided habitat, you've done all the other ecosystem services that I was talking about, that we're providing at the moment. And then meanwhile, around you are strategic other areas beginning to rewild. So your turtle doves, your nightingales, your purple emperors can just move into that habitat. And it's
Make it sound very simple, but the reality, the economics of that would be horrendous.
Well, we have to acknowledge the services that responsible land management is bringing us, and that has to be paid for. You're right. And the other thing I think that is beginning to be talked about, and could be a complete game changer, is the polluter pays. So if we have the polluter pays principle fairly addressed to farmers, that would instantly change the way that people...
But again, the Soil Association demand for a very long time, the polluter pays.
But I think
take into account the externalities.
But I think there is a feeling now of I mean, you must feel it too, in the last year or so, that there's a change of mindset. People are feeling differently. There's, the plastics revolution. There's the climate, sort of the whole feeling is different, that we cannot just leave it to our politicians to do.
30 years ago, when the Soil Association was taken over by a bunch of young thugs who said, this fuddy-duddy old organisation has got to be ripped apart and we're going to go. And they were hugely successful, but they were, where they now admit they were unsuccessful, is in properly changing the attitude, changing minds.
Yeah, but I think that time is right, just like it was with the plastics revolution. Suddenly, everyone had been talking about plastics for decades, and suddenly the moment was right, and people were thinking, okay, I get it now.
Yeah, but
I think the same, and I think because of the soil depletion, and we aren't necessarily at the cutting edge here in Britain, because we're in temperate zone Europe. We've got a nice climate, but in places like Africa and Australia, where they are really hurting, that's where you're seeing the amazing pioneers of regenerative farming and what can happen.
One other concern, I want to bring in some other people as well, so who, unlike me, really know what they're talking about. But that's
looking at the biodiversity of the estate, looking at the soil health, and we completely appreciate the climate emergency that we're in at the moment. So we've made some bold changes in 4 years as to what we're trying to do and how we're trying to go forward. The Wilding book and the Wilding project is influential to me. I'm 34, I don't look it, I appreciate. I'm 34, and God willing I'll have another 34 years left to farm. This book for me has come at an absolute perfect time. So we have 100% resistance to certain pests on our farm to insecticides. We are spending...
Sorry, be clear about that for people who are not farmers. When you've got what do you mean?
So resistance, a bit like antibiotics in the NHS and trying to monitor how they dish antibiotics out to patients. We've got the same problem with some insecticides to control pests in conventional arable farming. So it's important that we understand the battles that we've got. So
you still use insecticides?
Yes, we do. You have to use insecticides. So what we do is we use insecticides in a way that's an integrated farm management process. So we look at thresholds. So as and when a crop reaches a threshold or a pest reaches a level that the crop needs to be treated, we would use an insecticide. As of 2 weeks ago, when we had some results back that said your pest, this particular pest, is 100% resistant, we will only be harming beneficials. So it makes no sense to us at all to use insecticides.
So do you think that the rather crude way of looking at that is that you'll only stop using pesticides when you discover that there's no point to using them?
I don't think that a generation of farmers will say we'll only stop when it fails. I think that books like the Wilding book show that actually there is a perfect harmony to farm, to produce food in complete harmony with the rest of the environment. So we will have pockets on our farm. We've already got 32% of the whole area that we farm, including the woodland, is in some type of conservation. So but we know we've got lots more to do. So as opposed to, we have 6 fields, for example, that are over 100 acres each. So this autumn we will split those fields up by increasing bumblebee and bird mixtures through the fields, because we have to increase the amount of natural predators because the insecticide has failed, and we understand that system's broken.
Are you aiming for a system in which you will be using no insecticide, and indeed no...
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how long might that be?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, I think the fact that...
Years?
No, I think imminently, because I think it doesn't work. We've got two active ingredients as insecticides left, and they will break. So we'll be forced into a position where we can't use insecticides. So I think not getting hung up on that one product, I think the general consensus is we have to farm far smarter. We have to grow varieties that are resistant varieties. So things like the main diseases we've got, don't grow varieties in this geography that are susceptible to certain diseases. Don't plant them too early. Don't grow things that you're going to trip yourself up on later in the season. We've reduced our spend on pesticides by 22% in 4 years.
How about herbicides?
So general by 22%.
What about your use of mechanical fertilisers?
So our use of fertilisers, we now grow our own green cover fertilisers. So we grow cover crops. We import green waste compost from Veolia at Broughton. We've introduced 1,000 sheep onto the farm. So we lamb and then they graze the crops. Today was a landmark day for us. We actually spread our own farm yard manure back on our fields. So we are very quickly changing our system. So I think there's no hard and fast rule. That absolutely the Wilding example is a great example for farmers, and I think there are pockets. I am as guilty as every other farmer. I used to think, probably up until last year, that every grass margin should look like Wimbledon tennis court. Actually, that doesn't help anything. So I'm learning this process as well.
I should say, by the way, that he's learned quite a lot, because he was, modesty forbids him from saying so, he was elected or voted, whatever you say, the Farmers Weekly Farmer of the Year last year. So he's obviously... And Dagan, obviously your farming is very, very different from what Craig is doing. But how do you fit into this whole, use it as a sort of rewilding thesis?
Yeah, I think there's to be learned. We've all got to learn from each other now, and the divisive approach that in fact was partly issues around the organic movement that would be denigrating mainstream farming and kind of people coming into conflict about things. We've got to get beyond all that now. And the way I've been farming has been quite extreme. It's been no inputs whatsoever, no chemical inputs at all. And we've been kind of hovering on the edge of bringing in some rewilding, but still with fencing and still with planted fields and so on. But a lot of elements of what we've heard this evening chime with us, because we've been putting some of that into practice. But at the same time, we haven't been able to go all the way with it, and we've kind of kept the balance of more conventional agricultural productivity, like being concentrated on getting a yield of buffalo meat, whatever, from the farm.
Yeah, you're hardly typical in growing buffalo in real life.
Not at all, no, and the kind of nut way we've got of doing it as well, for sure. But so we've got, Izzy's got this extreme example of land management, and at the other extreme you've got very intensive systems, which perhaps be right to say, Craig's training was slightly more in that, that extreme, and then perhaps our system is kind of slightly in the middle of the two. And so what we're doing, we're all learning from each other, and obviously we're not going to rewild the whole country, but obviously what we cannot keep doing is farming the normal business as usual farming system that dominates mainstream farming in this country and the West generally. So I think we're all, Craig and I, we've started working together now, and that's kind of in a way is a nice sort of symbolic thing of what we all need to do, and bringing a bit more productivity and learning things from the way Craig is doing it. But Craig also, hopefully, is a challenge, is an interest of, further reducing his inputs and working in a system that involves more livestock.
And Alison, is it moving fast enough for you?
I think we've reached a point where the evidence that's available to all of us, just showing the damage that's been done through land use generally, so not just farming, but the way that we use land in all aspects. The evidence that it's causing damage is irrefutable, and I think if we were to ask people in this room, should we be looking at new ways, different ways of using land, I think everyone would say yes, and if we don't, then future generations are going to look at us and they're going to say, they knew what damage they were causing. Why didn't they do something? So is it moving fast enough? Is it moving fast enough? No, it's not moving fast enough. Can we move fast enough? I don't think we can't move fast enough, actually.
Tell these two guys on your right what they should be doing that they're not doing.
So I think what Izzy has described is absolutely part of that picture of changing land use. And I think all of us, farmers need to sit back and they need to look and they need to think about what can they do, where are the areas on their farm that they could make more wild, not necessarily turn their whole farms into a net, but what can they make more wild? Where are the areas that perhaps they're better concentrating on alternative land uses? Where are the areas that actually absolutely are, probably 100% about producing food? And I think all land is somewhere on that spectrum, whether it's developed land or intensively farmed land, or whether it's right at the opposite end, NEP, rewilded. And we need to be moving and making sure that we're continually moving along that spectrum.
But you're not suggesting we keep moving until we all are net?
We're not all going to get to net, but we've got to grow food, and that's so important. And I think we need then also to look at the choices that we make as consumers. I think that's so important to think about where our food's coming from.
Again, that's a matter of finance, isn't it?
It is a matter of finance.
We might be able to afford it, but other people
might. But I also think it's also a matter of actually people, and this might sound patronising, but I think people have forgotten how to cook.
I think that
and
is,
actually
is
how
we might all agree that. Can I suggest that to a wider audience, you don't say that, because that will sound, awfully. I know how to do it.
I'm not saying that I was. But I think we need. So yes, you need to think about your audience. But there was a programme in the week. I think it was the Chef Brigade, and somebody brought in. I think it was out in Norway, and they brought in a deer. As a hunter brought in a deer, dead, and they wanted the chefs to produce food with it. And the question was asked, how long would that animal feed your family? And they said half a year. And I thought, well, that's incredible. How do they make it last half a year? It's because they obviously are padding it out with vegetables, and I don't think we eat enough vegetables. They're padding it out with vegetables, and they're using the whole animal. And I think we need to be making consumer choices, and we need a really strong policy framework that I think both incentivises farmers to make changes, but I think also within that we've got to
we've got to reintroduce, or we haven't not reintroduced because we haven't done it, but we've got to return to the polluter pays principle. I think that's essential. I think we have to, because all the while you just rely simply on incentivising, what you're actually saying is, well, okay, you've got a choice. If you go down that route, we'll pat you on the back, we'll reward you, but actually, it's your choice, doesn't really matter if you don't. And so I think we need to through our new, the elms that Izzy mentioned, I think, you know, we need to be thinking about how we can really strongly incentivise farmers to deliver those public goods, of which biodiversity is one, of which addressing climate change, clean water is another, and we need to actually be much more robust about finding land use that doesn't, whether that be through taxation or whatever. I think we have to do it. We've got to take strong action.
Just one very quick observation, and that is that the people you have to persuade are the politicians who make the policy. An obvious thing to say, politicians have a single priority, and that is being re-elected. That is the priority that matters. And guess who are the people who, well, the majority of people in this country are not going to be able to afford, so they've never, I was going to say they've never seen a deer, that's ridiculous, but you know what I mean. If you live in a council house in White City, London or something, you're not really awfully familiar with making a deer last you half a year. You know, you've got to be more practical than that.
But John, they will not forgo their iPhone 10, and they will not forgo their Sky TV.
No, should they, Craig?
No, but they should.
You don't want to.
No, but what they can do is people do have a choice to support British farmers.
No, they don't. That's, if I may say so, that is patronising.
No,
and that's inaccurate. They don't have a choice, most people. Some people do, of course.
Yeah.
We, cosy middle-class people do. A lot of people don't. And the politicians will tell you that.
Yeah, I think if you're, what I'm saying is, if you have money to subscribe on a mobile phone, no, but I'm just suggesting that you can still buy British food with a red tractor standard, which is cheap and it has provenance and traceability. I'm not suggesting it's about haves and have-nots. All I'm saying is that there are choices, and sometimes, I'm not wishing to sound patronising, I'm just, from my perspective as a farmer, I sometimes think that perhaps we've engaged with chefs, we've had chefs onto the farm, and I've talked, and when I've asked, if you were to go and stock your kitchens up now, where would you go? And I've asked about welfare standards and traceability and things, and you know, some of that knowledge isn't there. So I think there's some of it education, some choices, but as a farmer, I'm as responsible to reach out to everybody as much as they are to...
Indeed. Let me take questions from, lady there. Two microphones, so you've got it, this one, and can somebody else put their hand up, and then we'll get another microphone so we don't have a delay. There we are, gentleman behind. Yes?
Isabella mentioned the idea of rotating the wilding with the farming, and clearly it's not practical to rewild the entire country because we have to produce food. Question for the farmers really, how much subsidy would we need for farms in order to, say, put aside a third of their farm for 25 years to rewild it and then bring it back into production on a rotational basis? Is it practical? Could we do it?
Very good question. Yeah. Jacob?
The maths on that are very difficult to quantify in such long term. But I think what it needs, it's not what the annual subsidy is going to be, and to work out those figures on it is very difficult. I mean, I think impossible to say. But I think the change in approach that has to happen will have to embrace multiple different ways of doing things differently and better, and part of that could happen. And in a way, you could say, well, we were paid for set-aside back before the agricultural system changed. You were paid for set-aside, you would commit to it for longer periods of time. But the trouble is, when it goes generationally, it's very difficult because who's going to be alive, who's going to be running it, etc., etc. But you could put into place much more long-term beneficial ways of managing the land that would be subsidised perhaps similarly to how set-aside was, to enable that recovery to happen. And ideally, a 25, 30-year-old length of time, that would be great in some circumstances if doable. But there are so many other things that you could do in more shorter time scales that would achieve a lot of the good that is required and is essential. And this thing is saying, John was saying, bring up the organic thing earlier, and a lot of these things can be achieved by organic farming. And that's where we need to put the money and the incentivisation, and that's where we need to be pushing farming as the new farm support system comes through and the new subsidy system comes through, if there is one, to encourage farmers to take all different approaches, all different ways of doing it. It's not like, hey, that's wrong, that's right. It's like wilding has its place, rewilding has its place, planting a load of trees has its place, going to organic farming and regenerative farming should become almost a bottom line for getting the subsidy.
Right, Craig, your answer to that?
Yeah, so to farm far smarter, a bit like what Damien said, so you can achieve much of those goods quickly with certain things. I think using things from, for instance, we're in a countryside stewardship scheme of which there is several options, from basic overwinter stubble, which has got benefits to farmland birds, right the way through to planting hedges, winter bird food, pollen nectar strips and things like that, 2-year legume fallow. So there's lots of options available to farmers. So to include them in our rotations and to look at longer rotations, look at grass, clover lays, lots of what we're trying to do back at Lockerley. The 25-year sort of set in a third-year farm is a good example of making an impact. Actually, if you look at what we're now adjusting our forestry to on the woodland on the farm, we're trying to minimise this kind of clear fell restock scenario of forestry because it's quite impactful on the environment. So looking more at continuous cover. So I think the example is 100% right. We need to look at our rotation and the block of land we're responsible for, and we have lots of different ways of doing it. The finances are very difficult to explain because the finances anyway in the farm business are very difficult. Yeah, there's certainly options to follow.
All right, thank you for that. The gentleman behind, I think you've got the mic. Oh, can we make sure that there's always somebody with a mic? It'll save a lot of time. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, it's me.
Sorry, you're lady. Yes. Can't see. You've got the lights in my eyes.
This is a question in relation to restoring the soil, and I think it was amazingly quick, really, how the soil restored. But I mean, do you look into trace and residue of chemical and fertilisers? I mean, when people stop using, well, really for everyone, but particularly in relation to NAB.
We would love to do more work on our soils. We've had some very basic soil studies done so far, and that has shown the carbon sequestration and the soil biota and the mycorrhizal fungi. But we would love to do much more in-depth soil analysis. It's just costly, and we're waiting for a PhD student to come along and do it, basically.
Yeah, more PhD students.
Or masters, actually, because then you get the results quicker.
Yeah, we don't. We haven't done any specific testing on that sort of thing, I'm afraid. But very much driven by the motive is that by stopping or reducing chemical inputs, you're going to get the benefit and result. And the amount of time it takes for them to leave the soil or be washed out, I don't really know. But I know that if I use less of them, there's going to be less there now, there's going to be less there in the future. And sometimes it's got to be governed by doing the right thing, because it's a no-brainer that it's going to start achieving objectives.
Yeah. Great, quick one.
So quickly, 3 things. 1, it's incredibly expensive pesticides, so the less we can use the better. 2, there's something called WIMBY, what's in my backyard, so we know exactly what is in this catchment, be it whatever the polluting chemicals are that are hanging around from years of use, so we know what to try and avoid. 3, we last year grew cover crops on the farm. We've done it for 3 years now, and we took some, I won't bore you with all detail, quadrat on the floor, cut the fresh mate, send it away, get an analysis back. So 35 tonnes a hectare of fresh weight, sucked up 150 kilograms of nitrogen, 50 of phosphate, and over 150 of potash. And if I said to any agronomist, how much would you put on to grow a crop of spring barley, they're probably the numbers. So I'm not suggesting that was all grazed, went through sheep and came back. So I'm not suggesting we've saved it all, but we've hopefully stopped it going up there and down there and into this chalk stream.
Yeah, so you know what you're taking out, and it's pretty much what you're putting in, right? So nothing's getting wasted or leached out into the aquifer or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Somebody got a mic?
Yeah, I have.
Oh, go on. Off you go.
Yeah. Okay. Just moving away from farmland, just for a moment, to the countryside. Here in the south, we have a lot of countryside under the control of national parks and wildlife trusts and the like. Do you think it's over-managed? And if so, what should be done about it?
I think there are areas actually that probably we have been guilty of over-managing. I think, so a prime example actually, some of the heathland sites that we manage, we have been, and it's been dictated to us actually, really hung up on targets. So you should only have X amount of bracken at any time, or you should only have X amount of gorse. Actually, they're dynamic landscapes, they're changing all the time, and we need to be moving away from that idea of having targets and having this landscape, you know, a picture of exactly what it should look like, and we need to be moving to much more dynamic, less managed systems. And I think if we can do that across the country as a whole, and you know, that alongside the things that we've been talking about, then I think there's so much more we can do in order to restore our ecological networks, to address things like climate change, to provide clean water, you know, all of the public goods and services that we've been talking about. So I think sometimes with some of our nature reserves, it can be quite difficult, because if you've just got a small nature reserve, and you know that you've got a particular species for which it's important, then the emphasis becomes upon managing it for that species. And that's where it's so easy to get hung up on it and to start over-managing. That's why we need to come back to, you know, I'm sure most of you will have heard in recent years about, you know, the principle of bigger, better and more. And if we can actually make our wild areas bigger, and we can make more of them, and we can make them better managed by better management that might be less managed, then things can thrive, and I think that's the way that we need to be heading.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Would you be able to use genetically modified GM crops to reduce your chemical use?
That's an interesting one.
That's the goods and what's the economics of it?
Yeah, indeed. Hands up, anybody? You can finish the question for me, can't you? Who's in favour of GM? And just as a matter of interest in the audience? Okay, I think you're slightly outnumbered, but all right. But come on, isn't that? And I have I've written a book about farming, and it was basically an attack on GM. But that was quite a long time ago, as in 9-10 years ago. And things have changed since then, and an awful lot of the things we were so terrified of at the time haven't happened.
But with a lot of, I mean, the state we're in right now and the world that we're looking at in the years to come, I think we can't just totally exclude any of the solutions that are on the table. They all need to be considered and looked at. But at the same time, like has been said earlier, as Izzy said, we are producing enough food already. And the food production systems we've got will produce enough food. And even in the more short term, moving to more regenerative farming, and if you remove the wastage, and the regenerative farming would still produce enough food whilst building soil and whilst bringing improvements long term.
The question then, though, why are there so many food banks in this country?
Why there's so many food banks?
Yeah, when there is all this waste food going on.
Well, yes, this isn't a question for a farmer. This is a question for societal management.
Of course not, but it's not a question. You can't use the waste food.
But you can't just get more and more food cheaper and cheaper and just keep throwing it at people. There'll still be people at going to food banks.
Neither can you use the waste food argument to buttress your own case, because it has been happening for an awfully long time, and people have been trying to do something about it. Maybe we are finally getting the message, and maybe it'll change. But
is this change happening that has been mentioned a couple of times, that we're hitting a point where we acknowledge the need for radical change is absolutely essential? It's no longer in question, and so maybe we can start getting past some of these problems. And GM crops, do we need them? I don't think we're not in a situation where they're urgently required, and the consequences of GM crop use, which is heavy use of glyphosate, often then that's
well, it depends who you believe. Some would argue much less use of glyphosate. I mean, anyway,
which turned out to a ban anyway.
It is a whole debate, and as you say, it's a redundant debate, that part of it. But a quick thought about GM, Craig, as a farmer.
As a farmer, I mean, I think if we look at the top 8 from memory, the top 8, I think there's 90-something oilseed rape varieties on the recommended list, of which the top 8 produced over half of the rape harvested. So actually, if we just looked at the varietal selection that's already out there, if you look at the traits that are already being bred into current wheat varieties. We've got wheat varieties purchased ready to plant this October, which which are resistant to yellow rust, which are the highest score, so 9 for Septoria triticide, which is a bad disease in this part of the country. So instantly we've said we bought the best genetics in that variety. We've reduced.
So in other words, you do believe in GM?
No, I'm not saying I believe
That's not GM,
it's
it's-
GM.
Well,
That's
but
selective.
that's arguable.
That's
Breeding.
using genetics. It's the same if you look at
But it's
cattle
a fine
breeding.
distinction, isn't it?
Agree. I'm not saying I believe or disbelieve. That's not my pit. I'm just saying how we do things at Loyally, and we're already using genetics in our favour to reduce pesticides going onto the crop.
Right? Yep, over there, or whoever has a microphone.
Thank you very much. To what extent is the problem caused by those devising the subsidy system to replace the CAP, the Eurocrats in Brussels, dare I say it, possibly the NFU and maybe the agricultural colleges, who are sticking to a model which is frankly outmoded?
Yes, indeed. I don't think we'll meet much argument on that.
That was a statement, wasn't it?
Well, I agree. I think you can take it that nobody here is about to argue with it, are you? No. Well, there we are. You made a very important point, and very succinctly, if I may say so. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, if maybe I could come back a bit on that. Firstly, I'm privileged enough to judge an environmental competition for farmers in the north. I'm northern, and a farmer. And,
It's all right. You haven't got to apologise.
I wasn't apologising, John. There is many farmers, not all farmers, but many farmers are addressing some of the issues and doing it without subsidies, and they are realising the problems, and they're addressing some of the problems with the soils. If I can get that out of the way first, because I think there's been a bit of farmer bashing here. Maybe I'm a bit sensitive, northern soil. My second question is, I'm an organic farmer, and as part of the organic system that I have, I rely on beef and sheep. We've recently seen a UN report that has painted red meat consumption as the biggest evil on climate change. And we've just heard Craig is introducing sheep into his system to help his soil organic matter and help some of the problems he's got with his soil. So how do we balance that? How do we give this message that actually, as farmers that are using a mixed livestock system, that our soil has actually got, our system has actually got some of the answers, and red meat is not the big evil that it is painted to be.
Thank you. And before I ask them to comment on that, show of hands again. How many of you, having heard, if you have heard what the IPCC said this week about all of us must save the planet by eating less meat? I mean, that's a pretty crude summary of what they said, but nonetheless, how many of you are prepared, assuming you do eat meat, to eat less meat as a result of that report? So, all of you will eat less meat, all those of you with their hands up.
In fields are very, very beneficial. They also produce something that's very nutrient dense, very good, very energy, health, etc. Takes care of all those issues. The problem, I think, the problem is, but then immediately fall into the next problem, which is the one you're saying about being able to afford stuff. We have to make differentiation about the meat we're eating and where it's coming from. And the environmental cost of certain meat production systems is causing the biggest damage and is this massive polluter, not only in the production system directly, but also in where it's bringing in its resources from. So, for example, soya coming from South America, which is our go-to feed to get animals to finish quicker, cheaper, making money quicker, keeping the price of food down.
Chopping down the rainforests.
Exactly. So it's how we can associate the benefits of properly produced and good and quality meat, but without it being a thing that only the rich can afford. So it falls into this whole kind of economics and who can afford it and who can't thing. But food is artificially cheap anyway. So maybe you could rejig that system and you could make the food that is very cheap in the shop, which we're not paying for the externalities of environmental catastrophe that has got that cheaply to the supermarket shelf. But if that was associated with it, it would put it much more on a par with a better quality grass-fed type meat product.
Indeed, but as we all know, again, the politician who says, vote for me...
Yeah, well, we could get so much more done without the politicians.
Well, that's very... I was about to say, but then I'd be out of a job. But I'm out of a job anyway in another
Oh, yeah.
so.
Yeah, you'll always find someone to ask if they...
John, can I just add to that? Because I haven't read the full UN report because it is huge.
It's a big report.
But I have read there's a 45-page summary, I think. And it does seem to me that there's been huge focus on the idea of actually eating less red meat. And a lot of other things in that report have been overlooked. But what I really picked up when I read it was that there's definitely an emphasis on much more sustainable livestock producing systems. And I think that's what we're talking about, I'm not vegetarian, but I don't eat that much meat, and I'm prepared to eat less if I need to. But it comes back to we need to be buying our food from systems that we can be confident are the right ones.
Yeah, no, we're out of time. In fact, technically, I think we're about 10 minutes over time. Oh, they said, well, that's nice of you to say, oh, yeah. You might cheer. Anyway, two more very, very quick questions. Yeah, go on, there's somebody. Microphone.
It precisely follows on from what you've just been saying. I am vegetarian, but I think I would be tempted to eat some meat from Izzy's farm, or possibly from this farmer on here. Because I would eat organic, well-reared, looked after meat, but I wouldn't eat factory-produced, mass-produced meat for lots of different reasons. But I think it comes down to education, and you've referred a couple of times, John, to people in council houses. They can't make choices, they haven't got enough money. They can make choices, and they can make choices at their own level, depending on how much they've got to spend. They can eat less meat, they don't have to not eat meat, but they can think about, where shall I spend my money? Shall I spend it on one free-range chicken, or shall I spend it on 4 or 5 factory-produced chickens? And they can think sensibly about how to buy meat and, to think of the provenance of the different meat that they've bought. I'll just give you a little anecdotal story. I had a conversation with my partner about a pot noodle the other day, and he said, the reason people eat pot noodles is because it's really, really cheap. 59p from Aldi, you can't beat that. But I said it'd be much better if you actually bought some super noodles and bought some vegetables and chopped them up, which refers to your point, Alison, about forgetting how to cook. You could get your 20p super noodles, your onion and your carrots all for sort of 50p, and you can make that last actually 4 or 5 meals. You don't have to have a plastic, potted noodle, which tastes rubbish anyway. You can actually make a nice nutritious meal. It's all about education. You've got to educate people somehow. How can we convince politicians to get the nation cooking, to get the nation thinking about where their foods come from? How can we persuade politicians that actually people are keen to eat proper food, properly reared, properly produced? We need some sort of government campaign.
Okay, thank you for that. There's no argument with that on this panel. So one final question, I think. Whoever has a microphone.
Could I?
Yeah, go on. Off you go.
We've heard quite a lot about the polluter pays principle, but I wanted to ask who in that discussion was the polluter. Is that the farmer who uses a lot of pesticides? Is it the supermarket who forces production? Or is it us who want to eat cheaply?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. Who on this panel is prepared to say guilty as charged? Well, I suppose you are, Craig. You are. It has to be you I'm looking at. From
I thought that would come my way. I think
I'm afraid it has to.
The Sustainable Food Trust did a brilliant document called The True Cost of UK Food, I think it was. And that talks specifically about all of what you just said. It came from consumer choices, practice of all different farming systems. So I think there's a general, everybody is involved in that. I certainly won't dress over the fact of past practice. I won't say it's bad practice. It was past practice for a reason in agriculture. But I think with things like Izzy's book, I think we've completely re-looked at things, certainly with me and how we'll go forward, to see how we can perhaps correct things and make them better going forward. So I think how you said it was perfect. I think everybody's involved, but I would urge anyone to look at that Sustainable Food Trust book, because it's quite sobering when you look at things like the true cost of UK food, when you link it to diabetes and NHS and transport and all the other things. So
I shall tell Patrick you said that.
Okay.
That'd be good. Anyway, and I'm going to finish with you, if I may, Craig, because in a sense you're at the nexus of this. I mean, we know you're not going to copy Net for entirely obvious reasons, and neither Dagan are you, but you have the potential of transforming the acres that you farm. In 10 years' time, how different will Lockerbie look?
Well, if you saw...
Take that 10 years as a,
Yeah, if you saw Lockerbie 4 years ago, when Mark, Julian and Sarah took on from their father, and how that farm has changed in 4 years, we're incredibly lucky we've got a family that has vision like they have. So we can't ignore that, and it makes my job so much easier because we know exactly where we're trying to go. So in 10 years' time, I do 100% see areas that will be wild. The farm will certainly be wilder, in line with kind of the Hampshire Wildlife Trust sort of.
But not wild, let's be quite clear, not wild in the sense.
It will be wilder. I think there will be small areas of the farm that we will look to rewild, and I mean it could be a corner of a field that is specific to the Barbastell bats that we have, or it is right next to the Triple SI at Broughton Down, that we will step back from because our current practice isn't correct there. I think the areas that we can farm for food, we'll do it in the considered way that we already do, in line with the kind of linking environment and farming principles. And I think as a whole, in 10 years' time, Lockerbie Estate, which feeds directly into the water that runs through Broughton and this wider catchment, it will be a far more sustainable farm. I'd be quite happy to say that.
Right. So we agree, ladies and gentlemen.